I never thought my life would bring me to a courtroom in Denver, Colorado, sitting across from the man I once believed was my forever. When I married Richard Hale, I honestly thought he was the kind of man who lit up a room. He had that polished charm that made people trust him instantly. He walked with confidence, spoke with certainty, and lived as if he owned every space he ever entered. I used to admire that confidence, before I learned that it wasn't confidence at all. It was arrogance. Arrogance built on secrets and lies. The courtroom felt colder than any winter morning I had ever experienced. The walls were high, beige, and empty, and the smell of polished wood mixed with a faint scent of paper and ink. I sat at my table in a pale blue suit I had bought for $180 from a small boutique in Boulder, wanting to look strong even though I felt like I was breaking inside. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I kept my hands folded tightly to hide the slight trembling in my fingers. Richard stood across the room, looking perfectly composed in a dark gray suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary when I worked as an assistant for a real estate agency years ago. He didn't look at me. Not once. He kept his chin lifted and his eyes focused straight ahead, like a king waiting for his crown to be polished. I knew that look well. It was the same expression he wore when he talked about money, business, and his so-called achievements. When the judge called the hearing to order, Richard rose to his feet with practiced elegance. He tapped his papers lightly on the table, a signal of a man who believed he was completely in control. And then, without any hesitation, he spoke words that sliced into me like glass. "Your Honor," he said loudly, making sure the whole courtroom heard him, "my wife is sterile. She cannot give me a family. I want an annulment, not a divorce. She gives me nothing, so she gets nothing." The room froze. I felt heat rush up my neck, then freeze halfway. There was a soft gasp from somewhere in the gallery. The sound of a camera shutter clicked. Richard knew exactly how humiliating this would be. He spoke like I was an inconvenience he needed to dispose of, a broken object he wanted to return without a refund. My throat tightened, but I didn't let tears fall. I knew this moment was coming. He had been pulling away for months. He stopped coming home on weekends. He slept in his office more often than in our bed. And when he did come home, he was cold, sharp, irritated, always claiming he was tired from meetings in New York or traveling for business in London. But the real truth was darker, far uglier than any tired excuse. Richard continued speaking, as if reading from a script he had rehearsed for weeks. He claimed that our prenup stated I would receive $0 if our marriage lasted fewer than 5 years. He emphasized that we were at 4 years and 9 months. Just 3 months short. He made sure the judge understood he did not want to pay me a single penny, not even for the time I had spent supporting him, managing his home, and pretending our life was perfect. I kept my eyes on the table in front of me. My fingers brushed over the smooth surface of my purse. Inside it was the large brown envelope I had prepared. Months of digging, searching, connecting dots, and chasing whispers had led to everything inside that envelope. Richard thought he was untouchable. He thought I was naive, quiet, and too gentle to ever suspect him of anything more than arrogance. He thought he could humiliate me and walk away richer, freer, and more powerful. He couldn't have been more wrong. The truth began unraveling for me the night he came home drunk and mentioned a man in Berlin who handled transfers. It wasn't a normal comment. It wasn't something an honest man would say. That moment stuck with me like a splinter under the skin. I started looking deeper into his business trips, wondering why he always paid for everything in cash, why he kept 2 separate phones, and why his calendar never matched his receipts. So I traveled to New York, pretending it was for a spa weekend. Instead, I visited an old accountant who once worked for one of Richard's companies. He told me in a quiet voice that something about Richard's money didn't smell right. From there, every thread I pulled led me to another ugly secret. Fake companies in London. Hidden accounts under different names. Loans he issued illegally through private channels. Smuggling antiques through real estate transactions. And money laundering is hidden under property renovations. For months, I kept digging, always looking over my shoulder, always scared he would find out. But I knew if I stayed silent, Richard would destroy me completely and walk away untouched. So when the judge turned to me that day and asked if I wished to speak, I finally lifted my head. My heartbeat was steady now. My hands had stopped shaking. "Yes, Your Honor," I said quietly. I stood up, walked toward the judge's bench, and placed the large brown envelope in front of him. Richard's smirk faltered. He knew that envelope. He knew instantly. His face drained of color. His shoulders stiffened. For the first time in years, he looked genuinely afraid. I didn't say another word. I simply returned to my seat and folded my hands again. The judge opened the envelope and began reading. The entire courtroom went silent, as if every breath had been locked inside a vault. And that was the moment everything started to change. People used to look at Richard like he was some kind of royalty. He loved walking into restaurants in Denver with that confident stride, greeting people like he owned the whole city. Everyone admired him, and everyone praised his hard work, never questioning how a man who barely lifted a finger could afford 5 homes across America and Europe. Our primary house in Boulder alone was worth about $3.8 million, built with stone walls, high windows, and a long driveway lined with pine trees. If you looked at the house from the outside, you'd think I lived a dream life. But the truth is, a house can hide a lot. It can hide silence. It can hide bruised confidence. It can hide a woman trying to pretend she isn't drowning. In the first year of our marriage, Richard filled our life with expensive dinners, weekend trips, and surprise gifts. He gave me a $14,000 necklace for our first anniversary. He bought a white Porsche that he didn't need. He decorated our home with Italian furniture that looked too fancy to sit on. Everything he did screamed luxury, but none of it felt real to me. It felt like he was performing, like he was playing the part of a wealthy man he desperately needed the world to believe he was. 2 years into the marriage, the cracks began to show. At first, it was small things. Receipts that didn't match his stories. Phone calls after midnight made him step outside to whisper. Trips to Europe that he claimed were for business, but his calendar didn't show any meetings. He often came home irritated, throwing his jacket onto the couch before pouring himself a drink. His temper grew sharper, quicker, and colder. He accused me of being forgetful, careless, emotional, and anything that made me doubt myself. It took me a while to realize this wasn't me being flawed. This was him losing control of the lies he had built. The first time I truly sensed something was wrong was the day I found the briefcase. I had walked into his study to drop off a package when I saw a black leather case slightly open on the desk. I shouldn't have looked, but something pulled me toward it. Inside, wrapped in neat rubber bands, was a stack of cash thicker than any book I owned. Later, I counted it roughly with my eyes. At least $95,000 in $100 bills. When I asked him about it, he didn't even flinch. He just shrugged and said one word he used like a shield. Business. I wanted to believe him, but something inside me shifted that day. A quiet alarm began ringing in my head. I wanted to ignore it, but it became harder and harder to silence. The night everything changed was a cold evening in December. Richard had been out drinking with clients, and when he stumbled into the house, he smelled like whiskey. He dropped onto the couch, rubbing his forehead and mumbling about how transfers weren't moving fast enough. When I asked what transfers he meant, he blurted something about a man in Berlin who handled things for him. Then he froze, realizing what he had said, and barked at me to go to bed. But by then it was too late. My heart had already dropped to the floor. What transfers? Why Berlin? What kind of business needed this kind of secrecy? I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the truth trying to claw its way out of the shadows. I knew deep down that whatever Richard was doing wasn't legal. All the puzzle pieces I had ignored were now forming a picture I wished I didn't recognize. A week later, after wrestling with fear and shame, I reached out to someone I never thought I'd need. A private investigator. His name was Evan Clark, a man from Boston who had built a reputation for uncovering financial crimes. I contacted him using a separate phone because I didn't trust Richard not to check my messages. When Evan met me in a small cafe in downtown Denver, I remember telling him, I think my husband is hiding something. He looked at me for a long moment and said gently, "People like your husband rarely hide just one thing." That was the beginning of a journey I never asked for. Evan spent months following Richard's paper trail. He traveled, dug through old company records, pulled property documents, and traced transactions that stretched across America and Europe. Every file he sent me made my stomach twist. At first, it was small things, accounts under different names, strange wire transfers, debts paid through offshore channels. Then it grew bigger. He found a network of shell corporations in London. Fake charities are created to move money without suspicion. Real estate deals in Chicago and California used to cover smuggling routes. Smuggling. The word felt heavy in my chest. I had married a criminal. The worst part wasn't the illegal money. It wasn't even the lies. It was the realization that every moment he told me I was lucky to have him, that I needed him, that I was nothing without him. He was the one living a life built on fraud. He was the one who needed the lies to feel like someone. I gathered every document Evan gave me. I hid them in a locked drawer behind my clothes, buried under sweaters so Richard would never find them. I saved digital copies on a small USB drive that I carried everywhere, even when I went to the grocery store. I lived in fear, waiting for the day Richard would realize what I knew. And then came the court hearing. The moment he stood there and called me sterile, thinking he could break me completely. He didn't know that I had been preparing for that moment for months. He didn't know that the envelope in my purse held the truth that could destroy him. He thought he had won. He had no idea his entire world was about to fall apart. The judge's eyes moved slowly across each page of the documents I had handed over, and with every second that passed, the courtroom grew heavier. You could feel the weight of the truth starting to lift the mask Richard had worn for years. His confidence drained from him almost visibly, like water slipping out of a cracked vase. He tried to swallow, but his jaw tightened. His hands clenched the edge of his table as if he needed something solid to hold on to before his world collapsed. For years, Richard had controlled every room he stepped into. He thrived on attention, admiration, and the illusion of success. But that day, under the fluorescent lights of a Denver courtroom, with the eyes of strangers watching, he finally looked like what he truly was, a man standing on the edge of a cliff he had built with his own lies. His lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Mark Whitfield, leaned in and whispered to him urgently, but the judge lifted his hand to silence him. The gesture was firm, final, and carried a power even Richard could not argue with. A tension rippled through the gallery as reporters leaned forward, pens poised midair, ready to capture the downfall of a millionaire they had once praised in their business columns. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Hale," he began slowly, "these accusations are severe." Richard rose halfway from his chair, his face pale. "Your Honor, those documents are fake," he said, his voice strained. "None of this is real. My wife has fabricated everything because she wants my money." I didn't react. I didn't even blink. There was no point in trying to defend myself with words when the truth was already laid bare in black ink. The judge lifted one of the pages closer to his face. "These documents include your signatures, bank transfers, company registrations, and property deeds. Are you suggesting you were not aware of these?" Richard stuttered. Actually stuttered. I had never seen him stumble over words in his life. He was the kind of man who always had an answer, a story, or a polished excuse ready. But now? He looked like a drowning man searching for anything to cling to. The room buzzed with whispers. Someone near the back murmured, "Oh my God." Another whispered, "This is unbelievable." Cameras clicked softly like distant thunder, capturing the moment his carefully constructed empire began to crack. The judge set the first file down and picked up another, thicker one. "This last document," he said, pausing for a moment as if to let the tension settle, "details money laundering through properties in California, Chicago, and London." His eyes narrowed. "It also outlines connections to smuggling operations." The words hung in the air like smoke. Richard's knees bent slightly, and for a moment, I thought he might actually collapse. His hand shot out behind him to steady himself on the table. His lawyer rubbed his forehead with a trembling hand, clearly realizing the case had evolved far beyond what either of them could control. The judge lifted a second stack of papers. We also have evidence of offshore accounts used for illegal transfers. Gasps spread through the room. A woman in the gallery covered her mouth. A man shook his head slowly. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to shock, then disbelief, and finally to judgment. Officers standing near the wall exchanged glances. They didn't move yet, but their posture changed. It was the posture of men preparing for action. Richard's voice cracked. "Your Honor, I didn't. This is a misunderstanding." His eyes darted toward me for the first time all day. They were filled with panic, anger, and something he had never shown me before: fear. The same man who once laughed at my doubts, dismissed my worries, and told me I'd be nothing without him now looked at me like I held the knife that could cut him down. I kept my face calm. I kept my breathing even. I didn't know him emotion anymore. When the judge finally lowered the documents, the silence was thick enough to grip. He nodded toward the officers. "Given the severity of these allegations and the supporting evidence presented today, Mr. Hale, you are hereby placed under arrest pending a full investigation." The officers stepped forward in unison. Their steps echoed across the courtroom floor. Richard's eyes widened. "What?" he shouted, panic cracking through his polished exterior. "You're arresting me? Based on her lies?" "These are not her lies," the judge said firmly. "These are your actions." The officers took his arms. For a moment, he struggled, pulling against their grip like a trapped animal desperate for escape. But 2 trained officers were more than enough to restrain him. They bent his arms behind his back and clicked the handcuffs into place. The sound was loud, sharp, final. Richard twisted his head toward me as they turned him toward the door. His face contorted with rage and humiliation. "You did this," he shouted. "You ruined me." I stood slowly, keeping my posture steady. "No," I said softly. "You ruined yourself. I just showed the truth." I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I didn't try to look like a victor. I simply watched the man who had made me feel small for so long finally stand in a room where he wasn't the one in control. As the officers led him toward the exit, the cameras flashed in rapid bursts. His expensive suit, once a symbol of power, looked like a costume now. His shoulders hunched. His head bowed. The arrogance he carried as a crown had vanished. For years, he told me I needed him. For years, he told me I was less. But in that moment, as the heavy courtroom doors opened and he was escorted into a hallway flooding with reporters and deputies, he looked smaller than anyone in the room. And for the first time in a long time, I felt tall. The weeks after Richard's arrest moved both slowly and painfully fast, as if time didn't know which direction to take. Every morning, I woke up in the guest room of the Boulder house, the same house he once filled with his voice, his footsteps, and his arrogance. Yet in those weeks, the house felt like a stranger finally learning my name. I would walk through the silent halls with a cup of coffee in my hand, realizing that for the first time in years, I didn't have to fear a slammed door, an accusation, or a sudden outburst dressed as stress from work. Silence, I discovered, has a way of healing the places inside you that noise once broke. But healing didn't mean the road was easy. Every day brought another round of calls, meetings, and hearings. Federal investigators dug through every corner of Richard's empire. They uncovered files stored in offices across California, hidden safes in a townhouse in Chicago, and old emails linked to transactions from London and Paris. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Richard's wealth was never built on talent or hard work. It was built on cheating, smuggling, laundering, and lies so thick they had trapped him long before the law ever did. I attended every hearing. I watched witnesses walk forward, former business partners, accountants, and even a man who once worked for him in Europe. Their testimonies painted a picture of a man who believed he'd never be caught because he buried his crimes under charm, luxury, and expensive suits. The prosecutors built a case so solid that even Richard's lawyers, with all their polished confidence, couldn't find a crack to slip through. Every time I saw Richard in court, he looked smaller. The expensive suits didn't shine the way they used to. His hair, once perfectly styled, now looked dull. His face carried a tension he couldn't hide. And every time he looked at me, his eyes were filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. As if he still couldn't understand how someone he had underestimated so deeply could be the reason his entire empire was being dismantled piece by piece. The day of the final ruling arrived on a cold morning in Denver. The sky was gray, and the air carried the sharp bite of winter. I wore a simple black coat, nothing fancy, just something warm enough to face the long day ahead. My heart beat hard against my ribs as I stepped inside the courthouse. Even after everything I had endured, stepping into that courtroom brought a familiar tightness in my chest. But this time, the fear wasn't for what Richard might take from me. It was for the final closure I needed, closure I had fought for with every breath. When the judge entered, the room settled into silence. The kind of silence that feels like a held breath across hundreds of lungs. He looked at the files before him, then lifted his gaze. "Mr. Hale," he began, his voice steady, "the evidence presented shows a pattern of criminal activity spanning several years and multiple regions across the United States and Europe. This court finds you guilty on all charges." Richard blinked. Just blinked. No outburst. No denial. No charm to hide behind. The judge continued. "You are hereby sentenced to many years in federal prison, effective immediately." A murmur spread through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Richard's lawyer swallowed hard. Then the judge turned his attention toward me, and for a moment, the world around me softened. His tone was no longer stern but measured with compassion. "This woman," he said, pausing, "risked her safety and faced years of deception. She exposed crimes that harmed many. As such, the court grants her full rights to the marital properties." My breath caught. Even after everything I had uncovered, even after all the documents I had handed over, I hadn't imagined the ruling would go this far. The judge listed each property slowly, as if placing them one by one into my hands. The Boulder house is worth $3.8 million. The townhouse in Chicago is valued at $1.2 million. The small apartment in London he used for laundering transfers. And the remaining legal funds in his main account, roughly $2.6 million. For a moment, the room blurred and then clicked back into focus. I hadn't asked for wealth. I had asked for safety, truth, and freedom. But the court gave me both justice and a future that no longer depended on anyone's lies. When the hearing ended and Richard was escorted out in handcuffs, he didn't look back at me. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe it hurt too much. Or maybe, for once, he had finally learned he didn't get the last word. I stepped outside into the cold Denver air, pulling my coat tighter around me. Reporters rushed toward me, shouting questions that echoed across the concrete steps. I didn't stop. I didn't answer. I walked past them, down the stairs, and onto the sidewalk with a calm I had never known before. The wind brushed my face like a new beginning. I drove back to the Boulder house slowly, watching the snowy mountains in the distance. When I arrived and opened the front door, the house felt different. It felt like it had finally taken a long breath after holding one in for too many years. That night, I walked from room to room, touching the walls, the furniture, the windows. Everything felt warmer, softer, more mine. I stood in the living room where Richard and I once argued, where he once raised his voice, where I once felt small. Now I felt tall, strong, free. My marriage had ended in the loudest way imaginable, in court, under fluorescent lights, with the truth spilled across tables in thick files. But my freedom started in silence. The quiet inside the house no longer felt empty. It felt like peace. And that peace was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard.